Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back to Victorian England, to the depths of winter, to the long, cold, dark nights when the frost crept across the window panes and the wind moaned under the doors, and we are going to ask a simple, quiet question. How did the poor, the ordinary labouring families of that age, actually survive the bitter cold? So, before you settle in, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from in the world and what time it is. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find it oddly comforting to imagine all of us, scattered across the world, lying awake in the dark together, drifting back through the centuries. And if this channel helps you drift off, tap that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure at all. I will be here regardless, talking quietly in the dark about the long, strange history of how people used to live. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for some soft background hum, and get comfortable, because we have a long and winding journey ahead of us tonight, back through the centuries to a world very different from our own. You do not need to remember any of it. Everything we touch on is gently told, a quiet and warm history held at a soft and comfortable distance, a story to drift away to. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to face a bitter winter night in a cold, drafty cottage, with only a small fire and a few thin blankets against the frost? Have you ever wondered how a whole family kept warm through the long nights, what they wore, how they slept, what they ate to keep the cold at bay? Have you ever wondered how the poor of that age endured the coldest nights of winter and found what warmth and comfort they could? These are the things we are going to drift through tonight, slowly, in the dark, the quiet, resourceful, deeply human story of how ordinary people survived the Victorian winter. Let us begin, gently, with the sheer scale of the challenge, with what the cold really meant in that vanished world. To understand how the poor of Victorian England survived the coldest nights, we have first to understand just how cold their world could be, how different it was from our own warm and comfortable age, and what a constant and serious challenge the cold represented in ordinary life. For we live now in a world of effortless warmth, where the turn of a dial fills our homes with heat, where we scarcely think about the cold at all except as something to be shut outside. The Victorian poor lived in no such world, and the cold was, for them, a constant companion and a real adversary, present in their homes, their beds, their very bones, through the long months of winter. There was, for the ordinary poor, no such thing as heating a whole house. The idea of warming every room, of keeping a dwelling uniformly comfortable against the winter cold, would have seemed an impossible luxury, and indeed it was one that even the wealthy did not fully enjoy. For the poor, warmth meant a single fire, in a single room, if they were fortunate enough to have fuel to burn, and beyond the small circle of that fire's glow, the cold reigned largely unchallenged. The rest of the dwelling, the corners and the upper rooms and the spaces away from the hearth, remained cold, often bitterly so, and the warmth that the fire gave was a small and local thing, a precious circle in a cold world, not the enveloping comfort we now know. The homes of the poor, moreover, did little to keep the cold out, for they were often poorly built, draughty and damp, with thin walls and ill-fitting doors and windows through which the winter wind found easy entry. Cold air seeped through gaps and cracks, crept under doors and around windows, chilled the damp walls and the bare floors, so that the cold outside was scarcely kept at bay by the flimsy barrier of the dwelling. To be inside, for the poor, was often to be only a little warmer than to be outside, sheltered from the wind and the wet, but still exposed to the pervasive cold that filled the poorly built and poorly heated homes. The house was a shelter, but a cold one, offering only partial refuge from the winter's grip. And the winters themselves could be hard, for this was an age of genuinely cold winters, of hard frosts and deep snows and long stretches of bitter weather, when the cold settled over the land for weeks and months on end. The winter was a long and serious season, Not a brief inconvenience, but a sustained trial that had to be endured, month after cold month, from the first frosts of autumn through the deep cold of midwinter to the slow, reluctant arrival of spring. For all that time, the cold was a constant presence, a daily challenge to be met and survived, shaping the whole rhythm and character of life through the long, dark half of the year. Winter was not a season to be enjoyed, but one to be got through. It is worth pausing, too, on how completely the cold shaped the daily rhythm of life, in a way we can scarcely imagine. In our world, the cold is something we step out into briefly and then leave behind, shutting the door on it and returning to warmth. For the poor of that age, there was no leaving the cold behind, for it was there in the home as well as outside it, there when they woke and there when they slept, a constant presence that had to be reckoned with in everything they did. The cold shaped when they rose and when they slept, what they wore and what they ate, how they arranged their homes and their beds and their very bodies. It was not an occasional inconvenience, but a governing fact of life through the long winter, a presence that touched every hour of every cold day and had to be met and managed constantly. To live through a Victorian winter as the poor did was to live in a kind of continuous negotiation with the cold. Against all this, the poor had only the simplest of resources, a little fire, a few coverings, the warmth of their own bodies, and their own resourcefulness and endurance. They had no easy warmth, no effortless comfort, but had to make and find and hoard what warmth they could, through cleverness and effort and the sharing of what little they had. And yet survive they did, year after year, winter after winter, meeting the cold with a quiet ingenuity and a stubborn endurance that is, when we consider it, genuinely impressive. How they did so, the many small and clever and touching ways they found warmth and comfort and got through the coldest nights, is the story we shall explore tonight, a story of human resilience in the face of the cold. Let that sense of the cold world settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the place where it was all endured, the home of the poor in winter. Let us step now into the home of the poor in winter, into the cottage or the cramped town dwelling where the ordinary labouring family passed the cold months. For it is here, in these humble and draughty homes, that the whole struggle against the winter cold was waged. To understand how the poor survived the cold, we must first picture the places in which they lived, the modest dwellings that offered such imperfect shelter against the winter and that formed the setting for all their efforts to keep warm. The homes of the rural poor were often small cottages, humble dwellings of a room or two, built of whatever local materials were to hand, with floors of beaten earth or bare stone, small windows, and low ceilings. These cottages could be cosy enough in their way, small spaces that a single fire might warm, but they were also often damp and draughty and poorly maintained, letting in the cold and the wet through their imperfect walls and roofs. In the towns, the poor were often crowded into cramped lodgings, a room or rooms in a shared and often decaying building where whole families might live in a single space, and where the cold seeped through the thin walls and ill-fitting windows, just as it did in the country. Whether in cottage or town lodging, the home of the poor was a modest and imperfect shelter. The great enemy of these homes, in winter, was the combination of cold and damp, for the poorly built dwellings were often damp as well as cold, and the two together made for a genuinely miserable and unhealthy environment. Damp crept up from the earth floors and through the walls, moisture gathered on the cold surfaces, and the whole dwelling could be chill and clammy through the winter months, the cold made worse by the pervasive damp. This combination was not merely uncomfortable, but genuinely bad for health, contributing to the illnesses that afflicted the poor in winter, and it made the achievement of warmth and dryness all the more difficult and precious. To keep a home merely dry and tolerably warm was, in these conditions, a real achievement. The furnishings of these homes were sparse and simple, for the poor had few possessions, and what they had was plain and functional. A few pieces of rough furniture, some basic cooking things, the bedding, and little else. There was no comfort of soft furnishings and thick curtains such as the wealthy enjoyed, little to soften the hardness and the cold of the bare dwelling. The very sparseness of the furnishings meant there was little to trap warmth or to make the cold rooms cosy, and the poor made do with what little they had. A hard and simple domestic world in which every possession had to earn its place. The home was furnished for survival, not for comfort, and yet, for all their hardness, these homes were homes, places of family and belonging, where people loved and lived and endured together, and where, around the small fire, a real if hard-won warmth and coziness could be found. However cold and damp and sparse, the home was the centre of the family's life, the place where they gathered against the cold world outside, where the fire glowed and the family drew close, where whatever warmth and comfort was to be had was made and shared. There was, in these humble dwellings, a genuine warmth of the heart even amid the cold of the walls, a human warmth that made the hard homes bearable and even, in their way, precious. Let that picture of the poor home in winter settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the very heart of that home, the fire on the hearth. At the very centre of the poor family's struggle against the winter cold stood one thing above all others, the source of nearly all the warmth they had, the glowing heart around which the whole life of the home revolved in winter, the fire on the hearth. For the fire was everything to the poor in winter, the single source of warmth, the place where food was cooked, the light in the darkness, the gathering point of the family, and its importance to the survival and comfort of the household can hardly be overstated. To understand the winter of the poor is, above all, to understand the central and precious place of the fire. The fire was, first and most importantly, the one source of warmth in the cold home, the small circle of heat around which the family gathered against the winter cold. Its warmth reached only a little way, so that to be warm meant to be close to the fire, drawn in toward its glow, and the space around the hearth became the living heart of the home in winter, where the family gathered to share in the precious heat. Beyond the fire's circle the cold reigned, but close to it there was warmth and comfort, and so the family drew close, gathering around the hearth through the long cold evenings, sharing in the warmth that the fire alone could give. The fire was the sun of the household, and the family its planets, circling close. The fire was also the place where food was cooked, for the same hearth that gave warmth also served for cooking. The pot hung over the flames or set among the embers, the family's meals prepared in the glow of the fire that warmed them. This double function made the fire doubly essential, the source of both warmth and food, the heart of the home in every sense, and it meant that the fire had to be kept going not only for warmth but for the preparation of the food that sustained the family. The hearth was thus kitchen and heater in one, the single point around which the practical life of the home revolved, giving both the warmth and the cooked food on which survival depended. And the fire was the light of the home as well, for in the long dark evenings of winter, when night fell early and lasted long, the glow of the fire was often the main source of light, the flickering flames illuminating the room where the family gathered. Candles and other lights were costly and used sparingly, and so the firelight served as the household's illumination through many a winter evening, the family living and working and gathering in its warm and shifting glow. The fire thus gave light as well as warmth and cooked food, a threefold gift that made it the absolute centre of the home in winter, the thing without which the cold, dark evenings could scarcely be endured. In its glow the family found warmth, food and light together. So central was the fire that its tending was a constant and important task, the keeping of the flame a matter of real concern, for to let the fire go out was to lose warmth and light, and the means of cooking all at once. The fire had to be fed and tended and kept alive, its precious flame guarded against dying, and this care of the fire was one of the essential labours of the winter home, a task that could not be neglected. The whole comfort and survival of the family depended on the keeping of the fire, and so it was watched over and tended with care. The precious flame at the heart of the home kept burning against the cold and the dark. Let that image of the glowing hearth settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the great problem that the fire posed, the getting of the fuel to feed it. The fire was the heart of the winter home, but a fire needs fuel, and the getting of that fuel was one of the great and constant problems of the poor in winter, a source of real difficulty and expense, for fuel cost money or labour to obtain, and the poor had little of either to spare. To keep the precious fire burning through the long winter, the family had to find the fuel to feed it, and this was no small matter, but a genuine and pressing challenge that shaped the whole experience of the cold season. The principal fuel of the age was coal, which had become widely used for heating, and for many of the poor, particularly in the towns, coal was the fuel that fed the fire. But coal had to be bought, and it cost money that the poor could ill afford, so that the buying of coal was a real burden on the slender resources of the poor family, a significant expense that competed with food and rent and all the other necessities. In the cold months when more coal was needed to keep the fire going, the cost pressed all the harder, and the poor often had to make do with less fuel than they needed, eking out their small supplies, burning less than would have kept them truly warm. The expense of coal was a constant worry, and the shortage of it a constant hardship. Because fuel was so costly, the poor gathered what they could by other means, seeking out any source of free or cheap fuel to supplement or replace the coal they could not afford. In the countryside, people gathered wood, fallen branches and sticks and whatever burnable material could be found, collecting fuel from the land where they were permitted or able to do so. Others gathered whatever might burn, the various scraps and materials that could feed a fire, scavenging for fuel wherever it could be found. This gathering of fuel was often the work of children and women, sent out to collect what they could, a common winter task that helped to keep the home fire burning without the expense of bought coal. Every stick and scrap that could be gathered was a small saving, a little more warmth won without cost. The gathering of fuel could be hard and even risky work, for it might mean long hours in the cold searching for wood or other burnables, or venturing where the gathering of fuel was restricted, and it was a task that fell often to the most vulnerable, the children and the old and the women of the family. To gather enough fuel to keep the fire going was a real labour, undertaken in the cold, often for small return, a constant effort that the shortage of bought fuel made necessary. The poor could not simply buy the warmth they needed, but had to work for much of it, gathering the fuel scrap by scrap, stick by stick, in the cold winter days, a hard and humble labour in the service of the precious fire. The result of all this was that the poor often lived with less warmth than they needed, rationing their precious fuel, burning small fires or letting the fire die when it could not be afforded, enduring the cold rather than the expense. The shortage of fuel meant that warmth had to be carefully managed, the fire kept small, the coal eked out, the home often colder than comfort required, because fuel could not be spared. This careful rationing of fuel and warmth was one of the hard realities of the winter poor, the constant balancing of the need for warmth against the cost of the fuel to provide it, a balance that often came down on the side of enduring the cold. Warmth was precious precisely because the fuel to make it was so hard to come by. Let that picture of the struggle for fuel settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the clever art of making the precious fire last, the keeping of it alive through the night. If fuel was precious and warmth hard won, then one of the most important skills of the winter home was the art of making the fire last, of keeping its warmth going as long as possible, and above all of keeping it alive through the long cold night, so that it need not be laboriously rekindled each cold morning. This was a real and valued domestic skill, the careful management of the fire, and it was central to the household's comfort and to the sparing of the precious fuel. The great trick of keeping the fire alive through the night was the practice of banking it, of covering the glowing embers in such a way that they would smoulder slowly through the dark hours without burning out, preserving a living heart of fire until morning. By covering the embers with ash or arranging them carefully, the fire could be made to burn very slowly and gently through the night, using little fuel, so that in the morning the embers still glowed and the fire could be revived without the labour of starting it entirely afresh. This banking of the fire was a valued skill, a way of preserving the precious flame through the night and sparing the effort and the fuel of relighting, and it was practised carefully in the winter home. To wake to a fire that still lived was a small but real comfort and saving. The reason this mattered so much was that starting a fire from nothing was a real labour, requiring kindling and effort and time, and in the days before easy means of making fire, the relighting of a dead fire each morning was a task to be avoided if it could be. To keep a living ember through the night meant that the morning fire could be quickly revived, the household warmed and the breakfast cooked without the difficulty of starting afresh in the cold dark of the winter dawn. The banked fire was thus a great convenience as well as a saving of fuel, sparing the family the hard task of rekindling and giving them a quicker warmth in the bitter mornings. The preservation of the flame through the night was a small daily victory over the cold and the dark. The tending of the fire through the day, too, was a careful art. The feeding of it with just enough fuel to keep it going, without wasting the precious coal or wood. The managing of the flame to give the most warmth for the least fuel. This required attention and skill, the constant small adjustments that kept the fire burning efficiently, neither dying for want of fuel, nor wasting fuel in too fierce a blaze. The good management of the fire, the getting of the most warmth from the least fuel, was a valued domestic accomplishment, part of the careful economy of the poor home in winter, where every scrap of fuel had to be made to count. To tend a fire well was to stretch the precious fuel as far as it would go. All of this careful management of the fire, the banking and the tending and the sparing, reflected the central truth of the winter poor, that warmth was precious and fuel was scarce, and that survival and comfort depended on the clever and careful use of the little that could be had. The skills of the fire were skills of survival, the making of the most of scarce resources, the winning of warmth through care and cleverness rather than abundance. In the careful keeping of the fire, we see the whole resourcefulness of the winter poor, their ability to wring comfort and survival from the slenderest of means, a quiet ingenuity born of hard necessity. Let that picture of the carefully tended fire settle gently in the dark. We turn now from the fire to the body, and to what the poor wore against the cold. Beyond the fire, the poor had another important defence against the winter cold, one that they carried with them wherever they went, close about their bodies, their clothing. For what the poor wore was a real and important part of how they kept warm, and the layering and management of clothing was one of the everyday arts of surviving the cold, a defence against the winter that went with them out into the cold world and stayed with them in the cold home. The basic principle of keeping warm through clothing was the wearing of layers, the piling on of whatever garments could be had, one over another, to trap warmth close to the body. The poor wore what they had, and in winter they wore as much of it as they could, layering their garments to keep out the cold, adding shawls and wraps, and any extra clothing over their ordinary dress. Wool, where it could be had, was valued for its warmth, and the poor made use of woolen garments and any warm material they possessed, wrapping themselves against the cold in whatever layers they could assemble. The wearing of many layers was the simplest and most important way of keeping the body warm, a defence carried close about the person through the cold days and nights. The clothing of the poor was, of course, humble and often worn, patched and mended and handed down, for they could not afford fine or plentiful garments, and made do with what they had, repairing and reusing their clothes until they were quite worn out. Garments were passed down from person to person, mended again and again, patched and altered to serve as long as possible, for clothing was precious and could not be lightly replaced. This meant that the poor often faced the winter in worn and inadequate clothing, garments that had seen long use and offered imperfect protection against the cold, and the getting of warm clothing was itself a challenge for those with so little to spare. To be warmly and adequately clothed was, for the poor, no small thing. Certain items were particularly valued for the warmth they gave, such as the shawl, that versatile and important garment which could be wrapped about the shoulders and body for warmth, worn indoors and out, a mainstay of the poor woman's defence against the cold. Warm wraps and shawls, caps and mufflers and whatever could cover and warm the body were valued possessions in winter, the practical armour against the cold. The poor made the most of such items, wrapping and covering themselves as best they could, using every garment and wrap to trap the warmth and keep out the chill. The humble shawl and the warm wrap were precious things in the winter of the poor. Even indoors in the cold homes, the poor often had to keep their outer clothing on, for the single fire could not warm the whole dwelling, and away from the hearth the cold required that one stay wrapped and covered, even within doors. There was no changing into light and comfortable indoor clothing in the warm house, as we might do, for the house was not warm, and the poor kept their warm layers about them indoors as well as out, wrapped against the cold that filled the dwelling beyond the fire's small circle. To be indoors was not to be warm enough to shed one's wraps, and the poor lived bundled in their clothing through the winter, indoors and out alike, wrapped always against the pervasive cold. Let that picture of the bundled poor settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the place where warmth was most sought of all, the bed, and to the coverings that warmed it. When the fire burned low and the long night came, and the family made ready to sleep, it was to the bed that they turned for their warmth, and the bed and its coverings were, in the deep cold of the winter night, the most important refuge of all. For it was in bed, through the long hours of the winter darkness, that the poor most needed to keep warm, and the making of a warm bed, the piling on of coverings, the trapping of the body's heat beneath the blankets, was central to surviving the coldest nights. Let us consider, then, the bed of the poor and how they warmed it. The beds of the poor were humble things, often simple frames or even just a mattress on the floor, and the mattresses themselves were frequently filled with straw or other cheap materials, for the poor could not afford fine bedding. A straw-filled mattress, or a simple pallet, was what many slept upon, humble and rough but serviceable, offering a place to lie and, with enough coverings, to keep warm through the night. Some had proper bedsteads, others made do with whatever could serve as a bed, but for all of them, the essential thing was not the bed itself, but the coverings piled upon it, the blankets and wraps that trapped the warmth against the cold of the night. The coverings were the key to warmth in bed, and the poor piled on whatever they had, blankets and quilts and coverlets, and when these were insufficient, as they often were, any additional covering that could be found, old clothing and coats and whatever might add a layer of warmth. The aim was to build up enough covering to trap the body's heat and keep out the cold of the night, and the poor used everything they had to this end, heaping the bed with coverings, adding garments and wraps on top of blankets, building a warm nest against the winter cold. To have enough blankets was a real blessing, and those who lacked them made do by piling on whatever else could serve, for the coverings were what stood between the sleeper and the bitter cold of the night. For those who lacked sufficient blankets, the winter nights could be genuinely hard, the cold pressing in despite every effort to keep warm, and the getting of adequate bedding was, like the getting of fuel and clothing, a real challenge for the poor. Blankets cost money, and the poor could not always afford enough, so that many faced the winter nights with insufficient covering, enduring the cold as best they could beneath too few blankets. This shortage of bedding was one of the hardships of the winter poor, and the acquiring of a good warm blanket was a real prize, a precious defence against the cold nights. Charitable efforts sometimes provided blankets to the poor, recognizing how essential they were to surviving the winter, a gift of real warmth and comfort to those who lacked them. The bed, piled with its coverings, was thus the warmest place in the cold home, the refuge to which the family retreated when the fire died and the night deepened, the nest of warmth in which they passed the long cold hours until morning. To be snug in bed beneath a good pile of coverings, warm at last after the cold of the day, was one of the real comforts of the winter poor, a hard-won warmth all the more precious for the cold that surrounded it. The warm bed was the reward at the end of the cold day, the place of rest and warmth and safety, and the making and keeping of its warmth was one of the central arts of surviving the winter night. Let that cosy image of the piled bed settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the greatest source of warmth in that bed, the warmth of other bodies. Among all the ways that the poor kept warm on the coldest nights, one was more important and more touching than any other, a source of warmth that cost nothing and was always available, and that lay at the very heart of how families survived the winter, the warmth of one another's bodies. For the poor did not sleep alone in the cold, each in a separate bed as we so often do, but slept close together, sharing beds and sharing warmth. And this sharing of bodily heat was one of the most essential and most human of all their defences against the cold. The simple fact was that several bodies together generate and share warmth in a way that a single body cannot, and so to sleep close together was to be far warmer than to sleep alone. The poor understood this well, and made full use of it, sharing beds so that the warmth of each helped to keep the others warm, the combined heat of several bodies making a warm nest even on the coldest nights. This was not merely a matter of not having enough beds, though the poor certainly had few, but a positive and sensible strategy for warmth, for the sharing of bodily heat was one of the surest ways to keep warm through the cold night. Together, the family could stay warm in a way that none of them could have managed alone. It was common, therefore, for whole families to sleep together, or for children to share a bed, or for family members to huddle close through the coldest nights, drawing on one another's warmth. Children in particular often shared beds, several together, keeping each other warm through the night. And the sharing of beds among family members was simply the normal way of things, a sensible and necessary response to the cold. In the cramped homes of the poor, with their few beds and their many people, this sharing was inevitable, but it was also genuinely warming, the closeness that necessity required also providing the warmth that survival demanded. The family slept close, and in their closeness found warmth. There was, in this sharing of warmth, something more than mere practicality, a real human closeness and comfort, the drawing together of the family against the cold, the sharing not only of heat but of presence and comfort through the long, dark nights. To sleep close to those one loved, sharing warmth against the cold, was a comfort of the heart as well as the body, a togetherness that made the hard nights bearable and even, in their way, tender. The cold that drove the family close together also brought them close in a deeper sense, and there is something moving in this image of the poor family huddled together for warmth, finding in one another the heat and the comfort that the cold world denied them. Their poverty forced them close, and in that closeness was a real and human warmth. Even beyond the family, the sharing of warmth extended in various ways, for warmth was a thing to be shared and sought wherever it could be found, and the poor gathered close in many settings, drawing on shared warmth against the cold. Wherever people were crowded together, there was at least the compensation of shared warmth, the heat of many bodies making a cold space more bearable. This sharing of warmth, in bed and beyond, was one of the great and simple strategies of the winter poor, a source of heat that cost nothing and that bound people close, the most human of all the defences against the cold. In sharing their warmth, the poor shared their very selves and survived the cold together. Let that tender image of shared warmth settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the clever devices the poor used to warm the bed itself. Beyond the piling of blankets and the sharing of bodily warmth, The poor had various clever devices and simple tricks for warming the bed itself, for taking the chill off the cold bedding before they climbed in, and for adding a little extra heat to the bed on the coldest nights. These small devices and practices were part of the everyday ingenuity of the winter home, the clever little ways that made the difference between a bitterly cold bed and a tolerably warm one, and they are worth pausing to appreciate. One of the simplest and most effective tricks was the use of a heated object placed in the bed to warm it. A hot stone or brick or other object heated by the fire, and then wrapped and put among the bedclothes to take off the chill. A brick or a large stone could be warmed by the fire through the evening, then wrapped in cloth to prevent burning, and placed in the bed, where it would radiate its stored heat and warm the cold bedding, making the bed far more comfortable to climb into. This was a cheap and effective way to warm the bed, using only a stone or brick and the heat of the fire that was already burning, and it was widely used by the poor, a simple device that brought real comfort on the cold nights. The wrapped hot stone was a humble but precious source of warmth in the winter bed. Those who were a little better off might have a warming pan, a metal pan with a lid and a long handle, which could be filled with hot embers from the fire and passed between the sheets to warm the bed before one climbed in. The warming pan was run over the bedding to drive out the chill and warm the sheets, a more elaborate device than the simple hot stone but serving the same purpose, the taking of the cold from the bed. While such pans were more the possession of the comfortable than the very poor, the principle was the same across all levels of society, the warming of the cold bed by means of heat carried from the fire, whether in a fine metal pan or a humble wrapped stone. The warmed bed was a comfort sought by rich and poor alike. There were other small tricks as well, the wearing of warm night clothes and caps to bed, for much warmth is lost from the head and body, and the covering of oneself well before sleep helped to keep the warmth in through the night. Nightcaps and warm bedclothes, worn to bed, helped to trap the body's heat and keep the sleeper warm, a simple measure that made a real difference on the cold nights. The poor bundled themselves for sleep as they bundled themselves for the day, wearing what they could to keep warm through the night, adding these layers to the coverings of the bed and the warmth of the heated stone. Every small measure helped to hold the precious warmth through the long cold hours. All these devices and tricks, the hot stone and the warming pan, the nightcap and the warm bedclothes, reflected the same resourcefulness that ran through the whole of the winter poor's struggle against the cold, the clever making of the most of simple means to win a little warmth and comfort. There was real ingenuity in these small practices, the turning of a stone and a fire into a warm bed, the finding of comfort through cleverness and effort, and they speak of a people who had learned, through hard necessity, every trick for keeping warm that their simple world allowed. In the warmed bed, with its hot stone and its piled coverings, the poor found one of the real comforts of the hard winter, a warmth won through care and cleverness. Let that cosy image of the warmed bed settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the long winter night itself, and how the poor passed its dark hours. The winters of that age were marked not only by cold but by darkness, by the long, long nights of the winter months, when the sun set early and rose late, and the hours of darkness stretched out far beyond the hours of light. These long winter nights shaped the whole rhythm of life for the poor, and the way they passed them, the early retreat to bed, the sparing of light and fuel, the long hours of darkness, is an essential part of the story of how they survived the cold season. Let us consider, then, the long winter night and how it was passed. The nights of deep winter were genuinely long, many hours of darkness from the early setting of the sun to its late rising, far more hours of dark than of light through the depths of the season. This meant that the poor faced not only the cold but a great deal of darkness, long evenings and nights that had to be got through, hours of dark that stretched out through the cold season. The length of the winter nights was itself a challenge, a great expanse of cold darkness to be endured, and it shaped the whole pattern of winter life, the long dark hours dominating the season and requiring their own strategies of endurance and comfort. The winter was as much a season of darkness as of cold. One of the simplest responses to the long dark nights was to go to bed early, to retreat to the warmth of the bed when the light and the fire could no longer be sustained, and to pass the long dark hours in sleep. Since light and fuel were precious and costly, there was little sense in staying up through the long dark evenings burning both, and so the poor often went to bed early in winter, retreating to the warm bed when darkness fell, and rising late, passing much of the long night in sleep. This early retreat to bed saved both fuel and light and provided warmth, the bed being the warmest place and sleep a way of passing the cold, dark hours, and so the poor slept long in winter, their lives falling into rhythm with the long nights. To sleep through the cold and dark was itself a strategy of survival. The sparing of light was a real consideration, for candles and other means of light cost money, and the poor used them sparingly, relying often on the light of the fire alone through the evening, and using precious candles only when necessary. In the long dark evenings, the family gathered in the firelight, making do with its flickering glow, saving their candles and lamps, living in the dim, warm light of the hearth. This careful use of light was part of the economy of the winter home, the sparing of every costly thing, and it meant that the winter evenings were dim as well as long, passed in the soft, uncertain light of the fire, rather than the bright illumination we now enjoy. The poor lived their winter evenings in a gentle darkness, lit only by the glow of the flames, and yet the long winter nights had their comforts too, for the early retreat to the warm bed, the gathering in the firelight, the long hours of rest, brought their own quiet pleasures amid the hardship. To be snug in bed while the wind howled outside, to gather warm by the fire through the dark evening, to sleep long and deep through the winter night, were real comforts, the warm and cosy side of the long dark season. There was a kind of hibernation to the winter of the poor, a drawing in and slowing down, a passing of the dark cold hours in warmth and rest, that had its own gentle appeal even amid the hardship of the cold. The long winter night was hard, but it was also, in its way, a time of rest and warmth and quiet. Let that restful image settle gently in the dark. We turn now to another great source of warmth and comfort, the food that the poor ate against the cold. Warmth came not only from the fire and the bed and the sharing of bodies, but also from within, from the food that the poor ate, for a warm meal in the belly was one of the real comforts and necessities of the winter, giving both the warmth of the hot food and the deeper sustenance that helped the body to endure the cold. The food of the winter poor, humble as it was, played a real part in their survival of the cold season, and it is worth considering what they ate and how it helped them keep warm. The great comfort of winter food was the hot meal, the warm food that gave immediate comfort and warmth against the cold, and the poor valued above all the dishes that could be cooked in the pot over the fire and eaten hot. A bowl of hot broth or pottage, a warm porridge, anything that came steaming from the pot brought real comfort on a cold day, warming the body from within and giving a sense of comfort and sustenance that cold food could not. The hot meal was one of the great pleasures and necessities of the winter poor, the warmth of the food adding to the warmth of the fire, a comfort eagerly sought after the cold labours of the day. To come in from the cold to a hot bowl of pottage was one of the real comforts of the poor winter. The staple foods of the poor were humble and filling, the bread and the pottage and the simple dishes that formed the basis of their diet. And in winter these plain foods were especially valued for the warmth and sustenance they gave. Pottage, a kind of thick soup or stew, made from whatever vegetables and grains and scraps were available, was a mainstay, cooked in the pot over the fire and eaten hot, filling and warming and cheap. Bread was the other great staple, and together these humble foods sustained the poor through the winter, plain and monotonous perhaps, but warming and filling, the fuel that the body needed to endure the cold. The simple pottage and bread of the poor were, in winter, a real comfort and a real necessity. The winter diet was, of course, limited by what was available in the cold season, for fresh food was scarce in winter, and the poor made do with what could be stored or preserved or afforded. The variety of the summer and autumn gave way to the monotony of the winter fare. The stored and preserved foods, the root vegetables that kept through the cold months, the salted provisions, the plain staples. This limited winter diet was less varied and less fresh than the food of the warmer months, but it sustained the poor through the winter, the stored and humble foods providing the sustenance they needed until the return of spring and its fresh abundance. The winter table was plain, but it kept the poor alive and gave what warmth and comfort it could. The importance of food to surviving the cold went beyond mere comfort, for the body needs sustenance to generate its own warmth, and adequate food was genuinely essential to enduring the winter cold. A well-fed body could better withstand the cold, generating its own heat, while hunger made the cold far harder to bear, the underfed body less able to keep itself warm. This meant that the getting of enough food was, like the getting of fuel and blankets, a real part of surviving the winter, the sustenance from within working together with the warmth from without to keep the cold at bay. Food was fuel for the body's own fire, and the winter poor needed it as they needed the fire on the hearth. Let that warm image of the hot meal settle gently in the dark. We turn now to how the poor prepared for winter, storing and preserving against the cold months. The scarcity of fresh food in winter meant that survival of the cold season depended in large part on preparation, on the storing and preserving of food during the times of plenty, so that there would be something to eat through the barren months of winter. This work of laying in provisions against the winter was an essential part of the yearly rhythm of the poor, a looking ahead to the hard season, and it reflected the careful foresight that survival in a hard world required. Let us consider, then, how the poor prepared their food against the winter. The key to winter food was preparation in the seasons of plenty, the gathering and storing and preserving of food in the autumn, when the harvest came in and food was more abundant, against the coming scarcity of winter. In the autumn, the poor laid in what they could, storing away the foods that would keep, preserving what could be preserved, building up a store against the winter months when little fresh food would be available. This autumn preparation was a vital part of surviving the winter, the laying in of provisions that would have to last through the cold, barren season, and it required foresight and effort, the working ahead to provide for the hard months to come. The autumn was a time of gathering and storing against the winter's want. Certain foods kept well through the winter and were therefore especially valued for winter storage, above all the root vegetables that could be stored for months, and the grains and pulses that would keep, and these formed the backbone of the winter store. Root vegetables could be kept through the cold months in stores and cellars, providing food through the winter, and grains and dried pulses likewise kept well and could be drawn upon through the season. These storable foods were the mainstay of the winter diet, the provisions that had been laid in against the cold months, and the poor relied upon them heavily through the winter, drawing on their stores until the return of fresh food in spring. The humble root vegetable, keeping quietly through the winter, was a real staple of survival. Preservation was another important means of providing for winter, the treating of foods so that they would keep, above all the salting and other preserving of provisions, so that they might last through the cold months. Foods that would otherwise spoil could be preserved by salting and other methods, extending their life through the winter and adding to the store of winter provisions. This preservation of food was an important skill and practice, the making of perishable food into provisions that would keep, and it helped to provide the poor with sustenance through the months when fresh food was scarce. The preserved provisions laid up against the winter were part of the careful provision for the hard season. All this preparation, the storing and preserving and laying in of provisions, reflected the foresight and prudence that survival required, the looking ahead to the hard season and the working to provide for it. The poor could not simply obtain food when they needed it in winter, as we can, but had to prepare in advance to lay up in the autumn against the want of winter, a foresight born of necessity in a world where winter meant real scarcity. This preparation was one of the essential arts of the winter poor, the providing in advance for the hard months, and it speaks of a people who lived close to the rhythms of the seasons, and who had learned to look ahead and prepare for the winter's want. Let that prudent image of the winter store settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the simple comfort of a hot drink against the cold. Among the simplest and most cherished comforts of the winter poor was the hot drink, the warm cup that could be held in cold hands and sipped for comfort, warming the body from within and offering a small but real pleasure amid the hardship of the cold. The hot drink was one of the everyday comforts of winter, a source of warmth and cheer that even the poor could often manage, and it deserves its place in our account of how they kept the cold at bay. The great virtue of a hot drink was the immediate comfort it gave, the warmth of the cup in the cold hands, the heat of the drink in the cold body, the simple pleasure of something warm on a cold day. To hold a warm cup and sip a hot drink was a real comfort, a warming of both body and spirit, and it was one of the small pleasures that made the winter bearable. The hot drink warmed from within, spreading its heat through the cold body, and the very holding of the warm cup was a comfort to cold hands, a small and simple pleasure that the poor could enjoy even amid their hardship. The warm cup was one of the everyday comforts of the winter poor. Tea became, over the course of the age, an increasingly common drink among the poor, and the hot cup of tea was a real comfort in winter, a warming drink that could be brewed and enjoyed even by those of modest means. Tea, once a luxury, became more widely available and more affordable, and it became a staple comfort of the ordinary people, a hot and warming drink that cheered the cold days. The cup of tea, hot and comforting, was one of the small pleasures of the poor, a warming drink that offered comfort and cheer, and it became woven into the everyday life of the ordinary people, a source of warmth and a little comfort in the cold. The humble cup of tea was a real solace in the winter. Other warm drinks too offered their comfort, the various hot beverages that could be made and enjoyed, warming the body and cheering the spirit on a cold day. Any hot drink offered the same essential comfort, the warmth of the cup and the heat of the drink, and the poor made and enjoyed what warm drinks they could, finding in them a small but real comfort against the cold. The warming drink, whatever it might be, was one of the everyday pleasures of the winter, a simple comfort that helped to make the cold season bearable, and the poor valued these small warm comforts amid the hardship of the cold. A hot drink was a little warmth that even the poor could usually find. There was in the hot drink something more than mere physical warmth, a comfort of the spirit as well as the body, a small ritual of warmth and cheer that brought a moment of pleasure amid the hardship. To pause in the cold day for a warm drink, to hold the warm cup and feel its heat, to enjoy a moment of warmth and comfort, was a small pleasure that lifted the spirit as well as warming the body. These small comforts mattered in the hard winter of the poor, the little warmths and pleasures that made the cold season bearable, and the hot drink was among the most cherished of them, a simple and everyday comfort that brought warmth and cheer to the cold days. Let that comforting image of the warm cup settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the harder side of winter, the work that had to go on even in the cold. For all that winter was a season of drawing in and keeping warm, it was not a season of rest, for the work of life had to go on, and much of it had to be done out in the cold, in the hard conditions of the winter. The poor could not simply retreat from the cold and wait for spring, but had to labour through the winter as through the rest of the year, and the work of the cold season, often done outdoors in bitter conditions, was one of the real hardships of the winter poor. Let us consider then the work that went on through the cold. Much of the work of the poor was outdoor work, labour in the fields and the yards and the streets, and this work continued through the winter, done out in the cold and the wet and the wind, whatever the weather. The agricultural labourer, the outdoor worker, faced the winter not from the warmth of indoors but out in the elements, working through the cold days at the tasks that could not wait for spring. This outdoor winter work was genuinely hard, the labour made harder by the cold and the wet, the hands numb and the body chilled, the work going on regardless of the bitter conditions. To labour outdoors through the winter was one of the real hardships of the poor, the cold adding its burden to the toil. Winter brought its own particular tasks as well, the work specific to the cold season, for there were things that had to be done in winter, and the rhythm of labour shifted with the seasons rather than ceasing. There was work to be done in every season, and winter had its share, the tasks that belonged to the cold months, done out in the winter conditions. The poor worked through the winter at whatever labour was to be had, for they could not afford to be idle, and the getting of work and the doing of it went on through the cold season as through the rest of the year. Winter was not a holiday for the poor, but a season of labour like any other, its work done in the cold. For some, winter meant harder times in the matter of work, for certain kinds of labour were scarcer in the cold months, and some of the poor found work harder to come by in winter, adding the hardship of want to the hardship of cold. Where work depended on the season or the weather, the winter could mean less work and less income, a real difficulty for those who lived from hand to mouth. The cold season bringing not only cold, but sometimes scarcity of the work on which survival depended. This seasonal scarcity of work was one of the hardships of the winter poor, the cold months sometimes bringing want as well as cold, a double burden on those with the least to spare. Winter could be a hungry season as well as a cold one. The need to work through the cold made all the more precious the warmth of the home to which the worker returned, the fire and the hot meal and the warm bed that awaited after the cold labours of the day. To come in from the bitter cold of outdoor work to the warmth of the fire, to the comfort of a hot meal and eventually the warm bed, was one of the real rewards of the winter, the warmth all the sweeter for the cold that had preceded it. The hard work in the cold and the warm refuge of the home were two sides of the winter poor's experience, the toil and the comfort, the cold labour and the hard-won warmth, and the one made the other all the more precious. Let that picture of the winter worker settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the frozen world outside the door, the landscape transformed by the winter cold. Beyond the walls of the cottage, beyond the small circle of the fire's warmth, lay the frozen world of the winter, the landscape transformed by the cold into something hard and white and glittering, beautiful and difficult in equal measure. This frozen world outside was the setting for the whole winter struggle, the cold and snowy and icy world through which the poor moved and worked and gathered their fuel. And it is worth pausing to picture it, for it shaped the whole experience of the season. When the deep cold came, it transformed the familiar landscape utterly, the fields and lanes and rooftops white with snow, the ponds and puddles frozen hard, the trees bare and rimed with frost. The whole world hushed and changed under its blanket of white. The snow could be beautiful, the landscape made lovely and strange by its white covering, the frost sparkling on every surface, the world transformed into something clean and glittering and quiet. There was a real beauty in the frozen world, a loveliness in the snow and the frost and the ice. And even the poor, for all the hardship the cold brought, could see and feel the strange beauty of the winter landscape. The frozen world was hard, but it was also, in its way, beautiful. But the snow and ice brought real difficulties as well as beauty, for the frozen world was hard to move through and work in, the snow blocking the lanes, the ice making every surface treacherous, the cold making every outdoor task harder. Travel became difficult when the snow lay deep, the roads and paths blocked or made hazardous, and the ordinary business of moving about and working was made harder by the frozen conditions. The snow that was beautiful to look at was also an obstacle to be struggled through, the ice a danger underfoot, the frozen world a difficult place to live and work. The beauty of the winter landscape came at the price of real practical difficulty. One particular hardship of the frozen world was the freezing of water, for when the cold was deep enough, the very water that people needed froze solid, the wells and streams and water sources icing over, so that the getting of water became a real labour. To obtain water when all was frozen meant breaking the ice, or thawing frozen supplies, or struggling to reach water that the cold had locked away, an added difficulty in the daily round of the winter. The freezing of the water was one of the practical trials of the deep cold, the turning of the essential and usually easy task of getting water into a real struggle against the ice. Even water, the most basic of needs, was made hard to obtain by the frozen world. And yet there was, in the frozen world, a quiet and a stillness that had its own strange peace. The muffled silence of the snow, the hushed and glittering landscape, the world slowed and stilled by the cold, the deep snow-muffled sound. The frozen world lay quiet and still, and there was a real peace in this winter stillness, a quiet beauty in the hushed white landscape. For all its hardship, the frozen world had this gift of quiet and beauty, the still and glittering winter landscape that could, for a moment, take the breath away even amid the struggle to survive it. The frozen world was hard and beautiful and still, the strange and lovely setting of the winter poor's endurance. Let that image of the frozen world settle gently in the dark. We turn now, gently and with care, to the real dangers that the cold could bring. We come now to the harder truth that lay behind all the efforts of the poor to keep warm, the reason that warmth mattered so much and its lack was so feared, the real dangers that the cold could bring. We shall treat this gently and with care, without dwelling on anything distressing, for our purpose is not to trouble but to understand why warmth was so precious, and to honour the seriousness of what the poor faced and overcame. The cold was not merely uncomfortable, but could be genuinely dangerous, and this is part of why their survival of it deserves our respect. The cold posed real risks to health and well-being, particularly for the vulnerable, and prolonged exposure to cold, or the lack of adequate warmth over the long winter, could genuinely harm the body and contribute to illness and worse. This was understood in its way by the poor, who knew that the cold was to be feared as well as endured, that the failure to keep warm enough could have serious consequences. The precariousness of their warmth, the constant struggle to keep the cold at bay with such slender means, was not merely a matter of comfort but sometimes of survival, and this gave a real seriousness to all their efforts to keep warm. The stakes of the winter struggle were high, and the poor knew it. The most vulnerable to the cold were, as ever, the very young, the very old, and the sick, those whose bodies were least able to withstand the cold and generate their own warmth. And for these the winter posed the greatest dangers. The frail elderly, the young children, the already ill, felt the cold most keenly and suffered from it most seriously, and the protection of these vulnerable members of the family was a particular concern in winter. Much of the family's effort to keep warm was, in a sense, an effort to protect the vulnerable, to keep the old and the young and the sick from the worst of the cold, and the care of these vulnerable ones was one of the quiet labours of the winter home. To keep the frail warm was a real and serious task. The dangers of the cold were made worse by the other hardships that often accompanied poverty, the inadequate food, the poor and damp housing, the lack of sufficient fuel and clothing, all of which combined to make the cold harder to bear and more dangerous. Where warmth and food and shelter were all inadequate together, the winter pressed hard indeed, the various hardships compounding one another, the cold more dangerous for the hunger and the damp and the want that accompanied it. This combination of hardships was the real face of winter poverty, the cold made more perilous by the other deprivations that so often went with it, and it was against this combined hardship that the poor had to struggle. The cold was hardest on those who lacked everything else as well, and yet, against all these dangers the poor endured, meeting the perils of the cold with their resourcefulness and their care and their mutual support, protecting the vulnerable as best they could, surviving the hard winters year after year. That they faced real dangers and yet endured, that they kept themselves and their loved ones alive through the hard winters with such slender means, is a testament to their resilience and their care for one another. And it is this endurance, this survival against real odds, that we honour tonight. The dangers were real, but so was the resilience that overcame them, the quiet determination that carried the poor through the perilous winters. Let that sober but respectful reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the illnesses that the cold season brought, and how the poor met them. The winter was, for the poor, a season of sickness as well as cold, for the hard conditions of the cold months, the chill and the damp and the crowded homes, brought with them the illnesses that flourished in winter, and the meeting of these sicknesses was part of the challenge of the season. We shall consider this gently, for our purpose is to understand how the poor coped, not to dwell on suffering, and there is in their response to winter sickness the same resourcefulness and care that marked all their struggle against the cold. The cold season brought its characteristic illnesses, the coughs and colds and chest complaints, the fevers and chills that flourished in the cold and damp conditions, the sicknesses of winter that afflicted the poor in their cold homes. The chill and the damp, the crowded dwellings, the inadequate warmth and food, all contributed to the illnesses of the season, and winter was a time when sickness was common, the hard conditions taking their toll on the health of the poor. These winter illnesses were a familiar part of the season, the coughs and fevers that came with the cold, and the poor met them as they met the other hardships of winter, with such remedies and care as they could muster. When sickness came, the poor relied on home remedies and simple care, the traditional treatments and the tending of the sick within the family, for the services of doctors were often beyond their means. The care of the sick fell largely to the family, to the women of the household above all, who tended the ill with the home remedies and the simple comforts that were available to them. Warmth and rest, simple nourishing food, the traditional herbal remedies and home treatments, the care and attention of the family, these were what the poor could offer to the sick, and they did what they could to nurse their ill through the winter sicknesses. The tending of the sick was one of the labours of the winter home, undertaken with care and love if with limited means. Warmth was especially important to the care of the sick, for the ill particularly needed to be kept warm, and much of the tending of the sick involved the effort to keep them warm and comfortable, close to the fire, well covered in bed. The sick were given what warmth the home could provide, the best place by the fire, the extra coverings, the warmed bed, for warmth was understood to be important to recovery, and the keeping of the sick warm was a priority even when warmth was scarce. This effort to keep the sick warm added to the household's struggle for warmth, the ill needing more warmth than others, and the family gave what they could to comfort and aid the recovery of the sick. The warm place by the fire was often given to the one who was ill. The meeting of winter sickness, like the meeting of the cold itself, drew on the resourcefulness and the mutual care of the poor, the tending of the sick with home remedies and warmth and love, the family caring for its own through the illnesses of the season. There is, in this care of the sick, the same quiet devotion that marked the whole of the winter struggle, the family drawing together to protect and tend its members, to nurse the ill and comfort the suffering with what little they had. The winter sicknesses were a real hardship, but they were met with real care, the poor tending their sick through the cold season, with a devotion that speaks of the deep bonds of family and community. Let that caring reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to how the youngest members of the family fared through the winter. Among all those who had to survive the winter cold, the children hold a special place in our thoughts. for the young were both especially vulnerable to the cold and especially in need of protection, and the ways in which children were kept warm and got through the winter are a touching part of the story of the winter poor. Let us consider, then, how the children of the poor fared through the cold season, and how they were protected and how they coped. Children were among the most vulnerable to the winter cold, their small bodies less able to withstand the cold and generate warmth, and so the protection of the children was a particular concern of the winter home. Much of the family's effort to keep warm was directed at the children, the keeping of them close to the fire, well wrapped, warm in bed, for the young needed warmth and protection through the hard season. The children were bundled in what warm clothing could be found, kept close to the hearth, tucked warm into the shared beds, the family's care directed at protecting its youngest from the worst of the cold. The keeping of the children warm was one of the tender priorities of the winter home. The children shared, of course, in all the family's strategies for warmth, sleeping close together and with their parents for shared warmth, gathering by the fire, bundled in layers and wraps. The sharing of beds was especially important for children, several often sleeping together for warmth, keeping each other warm through the cold nights, and the huddling together of the children was one of the ways the family kept its young ones warm. The children were drawn into the warm heart of the home, close to the fire and close to one another, sharing in the warmth that the family made and gathered, protected within the circle of the family's care against the cold that pressed outside. Winter brought hardships particular to children, the chilblains and the cold-related discomforts that afflicted young hands and feet, the difficulties of keeping active children warm, and these were part of the winter experience of the young. The chilblains that came from the cold, the discomfort of cold hands and feet, were familiar afflictions of the winter children, minor perhaps but real, part of the hardship of the cold season for the young. These small sufferings were among the everyday trials of the winter poor, borne by the children as by the rest, the discomforts of the cold that were simply part of getting through the winter. Yet children, being children, bore these trials with the resilience of the young, and children, being children, found their pleasures and their play even in the hard winter, for the young have a way of finding joy in their circumstances, and the winter brought its own amusements and delights amid the hardship. The snow and the ice, when they came, brought the pleasures of winter play, the games and amusements that children have always found in the cold season, and the children of the poor, for all their hardships, knew the simple joys of winter, as children always have. There was, amid the hardship, the laughter and play of children, the finding of delight in the snow, the resilience and joy of the young that brightened even the hard winter. The children endured the winter, but they also, in their way, enjoyed it, finding the pleasures that childhood always finds. Let that tender image of the winter children settle gently in the dark. We turn now to those at the other end of life, the old and the frail. At the other end of life from the children stood the old and the frail, those whose long years or whose weakness made them especially vulnerable to the winter cold, and the care of these elderly and frail members of the family and community was another of the quiet concerns of the winter poor. The way the old were protected and cared for through the cold season is a touching part of the story, reflecting the bonds of family and community that helped the vulnerable to survive. Let us consider, then, how the old and frail fared through the winter. The elderly felt the cold especially keenly, their aged bodies less able to keep warm, more vulnerable to the effects of the cold, and so the old, like the young, were a particular focus of the family's care in winter. The frail elderly needed extra warmth and protection, the best place by the fire, the warm coverings, the care and attention of the family, and the keeping of the old warm and safe through the winter was one of the responsibilities of the household. The care of the aged was a duty and a devotion, the protecting of those who had grown frail from the worst of the cold, and the family gave what warmth and care it could to its elderly members through the hard season. The old, like the young, were drawn into the warm heart of the home. The place by the fire was often reserved for the old, the warmest spot, given to those who most needed it. The elderly settled close to the hearth, where the warmth was greatest. This giving of the best warmth to the frail reflected the care of the family for its vulnerable members, the sensible and loving allocation of the precious warmth to those who needed it most. The old settled by the fire, wrapped warm, given the warmest place and the extra coverings, were cared for by the family with a tenderness that speaks of the bonds between the generations. The warm place by the hearth, given to the aged, was a quiet act of love and care in the hard winter. The care of the old drew on the wider bonds of family and community as well. For the elderly were looked after not only by their immediate family, but often by the broader network of kin and neighbours, the community caring for its vulnerable members. Where family could not provide, neighbours and community might help, the bonds of mutual support extending to the care of the old and frail, the looking after of those who could not fully care for themselves. This communal care of the vulnerable was part of the fabric of the poor community, the mutual support that helped all to survive, and the old benefited from these bonds of kinship and neighbourliness that helped to see them through the winter. The community looked after its own, as best it could. There was, in the care of the old and frail through the winter, the same devotion and mutual support that marked the whole of the poor's struggle against the cold, the drawing together of family and community to protect the vulnerable, to see the weak and the aged safely through the hard season. The winter tested the bonds of family and community, and those bonds largely held, the poor caring for their old and their frail, with a devotion born of love and duty, and the deep human impulse to protect the vulnerable. In the care of the old by the winter fire, we see the warmth of the human heart, matching the warmth of the hearth, the tenderness that helped the frail survive the cold. Let that tender reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to one of the great comforts of the winter, the warmth of company and togetherness. Among all the warmths of the winter, there was one that was as much of the heart as of the body. One of the greatest comforts of the cold season for the poor, the warmth of company, the gathering together of family and neighbours through the long winter evenings, the human togetherness that made the hard season bearable and even, in its way, sweet. For the winter drew people together, around the fire and in one another's homes, and this togetherness was one of the real comforts of the poor in winter, worth pausing to appreciate. The long winter evenings, spent gathered around the fire, were times of family togetherness, the household drawn close in the firelight, sharing the warmth and the company through the dark hours. With little to do in the long dark evenings and every reason to gather close for warmth, the family came together around the hearth, and these gatherings were times of real closeness and comfort, the family sharing the warmth of the fire and the warmth of one another's company. The winter evening by the fire, the family gathered close in the glow, was one of the warm hearts of the season, a togetherness born of the cold but sweet in itself. The drawing in of winter brought the family close. These gatherings by the fire were often filled with the simple entertainments that cost nothing, the talk and the stories, the songs and the shared activities that passed the long evenings and brightened the dark. Storytelling was a great pleasure of the winter evenings, the telling of tales by the fire, and there were songs and games and the simple pleasure of conversation, the sharing of news and talk and laughter. These humble entertainments, requiring nothing but the company of others and the warmth of the fire, were the real pleasures of the winter poor, the brightening of the long dark evenings with talk and tale and song. The fireside gathering, with its stories and its talk, was one of the warm delights of the cold season. The gatherings extended beyond the immediate family to neighbours and the wider community. For people visited one another through the winter, gathering in one another's homes, sharing warmth and company, and the simple pleasures of togetherness. The bonds of neighbourliness and community were expressed in these winter gatherings. The visiting and the sharing that drew the community together through the cold season. To gather with neighbours, to share an evening's warmth and company, was a comfort and a pleasure, the community drawing close through the winter as the family did, the bonds of kinship and neighbourliness warming the cold season. The winter was a time of coming together, of shared warmth and company across the community. There was, too, a particular magic to the winter gatherings that the other seasons did not quite have, for it was precisely the cold and the dark outside that made the warmth and light and company within feel so precious. To be gathered close by the fire, while the wind moaned and the frost gathered outside, to be warm and together in a little circle of light and heat surrounded by the cold dark, gave the winter gathering a special sweetness, a coziness, heightened by the very hardship it kept at bay. The contrast between the warmth within and the cold without made the fireside gathering all the more precious, the togetherness all the more sweet, and there was a real magic in these winter evenings that the milder seasons could not match. The cold, in a sense, was the price and the setting of one of the season's greatest pleasures. There was, in all this togetherness, a warmth that went beyond the physical, a comfort of belonging and companionship that helped to make the hard winter bearable, the human warmth that matched and exceeded the warmth of the fire. To be together against the cold, to share the warmth and the company, to belong to a family and a community that gathered close through the hard season, was a deep comfort, one of the real sustenances of the winter poor. The cold that drove people together also gave them the gift of that togetherness, the warmth of human company that was, perhaps, the greatest comfort of all in the long winter. In their gathering together, the poor found a warmth that no fire alone could give. Let that warm image of the fireside gathering settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the matter of light in the long winter darkness. We have spoken of the cold of winter, but the season brought darkness as well as cold, the long nights and short days that wrapped the world in dark for so much of the winter. And the finding of light in that darkness was another of the quiet challenges of the season. How the poor lit their long winter evenings, and how they managed the darkness, is a part of the story worth our attention. For light, like warmth, was precious and hard-won for those with little to spare. The principal light of the poor home in the winter evening was, as we have seen, the fire itself, whose glow illuminated the room where the family gathered, serving as light as well as warmth through many a winter evening. The firelight was the natural illumination of the winter home, the flickering glow that lit the family's gathering, and much of the winter evening was passed in this warm and shifting light, the fire serving double duty as warmth and light. This firelight was dim and uncertain compared to the bright light we now enjoy, but it was warm, and it was there, the glow of the hearth lighting the long evenings, and the poor lived and gathered in its gentle illumination. The fire lit the winter evening as it warmed it. Beyond the firelight, the poor used candles and other simple lights, but these cost money and were used sparingly, lit only when necessary and never wastefully, for light was a cost that the poor could ill afford. Candles were precious, and the humble lights that the poor could make or afford were used carefully, saved for when they were truly needed, the household otherwise making do with the firelight. This careful economy of light was part of the frugal management of the winter home, the sparing of every costly thing, and it meant that the winter evenings were dim, lit sparingly, the precious candles used only when the firelight would not serve. The poor lived their winter evenings in a careful dimness, saving their light. The management of light shaped the rhythm of the winter day, for with the daylight so short and artificial light so precious, the poor made the most of the daylight hours and retired early into the dark, ordering their lives around the available light. Work that needed light was done in the daylight, and when the dark came and the light was scarce, the poor gathered by the fire or retired to bed, making the most of the daylight and sparing the costly artificial light. This ordering of life around the light, the working by day and the early retiring into the dark, was part of the rhythm of the winter poor, shaped by the shortness of the days and the preciousness of light. The poor lived by the natural light where they could, and spared the artificial light where they must. There is something to reflect upon, for us who live amid such easy and abundant light, in this world where light was precious, and the winter evenings were passed in dimness, where the darkness was a real presence to be managed and endured. The long dark evenings, lit only by the fire and the sparing candle, were a very different experience from our own brightly lit nights, a dimness and darkness that shaped the whole feeling of the winter. And yet there was a coziness in it too, a gentleness in the firelit dimness, the family gathered in the soft glow that has its own quiet appeal. The winter darkness was a challenge, but the firelit evening had its own warm charm. Let that dim and cozy image settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the help that the poor received from others, the kindness of neighbours, and the charity of the age. The poor did not face the winter entirely alone, for there were bonds of mutual help among them, and there were also the various forms of charity and relief that the age provided. And these sources of help, the kindness of neighbours and the charity of others, played a real part in helping the poor to survive the hardest winters. Let us consider then the help that the poor received and how it aided them through the cold season. Among the poor themselves, there was a real tradition of mutual help, of neighbours aiding neighbours, of the sharing of what little there was in times of hardship. And this neighbourly kindness was one of the important supports of the poor in winter. Those who had a little might help those who had less, the sharing of fuel or food or a warm place, the small kindnesses that neighbours showed one another in the hard season. This mutual aid among the poor, the helping of one another through the winter, was a real and important thing, the bonds of community providing a measure of support and security, the poor looking after one another as best they could. In their shared hardship, the poor found the bonds of mutual kindness. Beyond the mutual help of the poor, there were various forms of charity provided by those better off, the giving of alms and aid to the poor, particularly in the hard winter season when the need was greatest. Charitable individuals and organisations provided help to the poor in winter, the giving of food, of fuel, of clothing and blankets, of the necessities that the poor needed to survive the cold. Winter charity was a real tradition, the recognition that the cold season brought special hardship and the effort to relieve it, and the poor benefited from these charitable gifts, which helped them through the hardest times. The charity of the season, the giving to the poor in winter, was a real source of help against the cold. Certain forms of charity were particularly aimed at the winter needs of the poor, such as the giving of coal or fuel to help the poor keep warm, and the provision of blankets and warm clothing, gifts directly aimed at the struggle against the cold. Coal charities and similar efforts provided the poor with the fuel they so desperately needed, and the giving of blankets and warm clothing helped to provide the warmth that the poor could not always afford. These winter-specific charities recognized the particular hardship of the cold season and sought to relieve it directly, providing the warmth and the means of warmth that the poor needed, a real help against the winter cold. The gift of coal or a blanket was a gift of warmth itself. There was also the more formal system of relief for the poor, the provision made by the parish and the authorities for those in need, which, whatever its limitations and its hardships, provided a measure of support to the destitute in the hard season. This formal relief was often grudging and harsh, as we shall see, but it did provide some help to those in the greatest need, a last resort for the destitute in winter. Together, the mutual help of the poor, the charity of the better off, and the formal relief of the parish formed a patchwork of support that helped the poor through the winter, imperfect and often inadequate but real, a web of assistance that aided survival in the hard season. The poor were not entirely alone against the cold. Let that reflection on kindness and charity settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the hardest refuge of all, the workhouse in winter. For those who fell into the deepest destitution, who could not survive the winter by their own means or with the help of neighbours and charity, there remained one last resort, a hard and dreaded one, the institution that the age provided for the utterly destitute, the workhouse. We shall consider this soberly and with care, for it was a hard aspect of the age, and the workhouse in winter represents the last and grimmest refuge against the cold, the place to which the most desperate turned when all else failed. The workhouse was the institution provided for the destitute, offering food and shelter to those who had no other means of survival, but doing so under a harsh regime that made it a place of last resort, dreaded and avoided if at all possible. To enter the workhouse was to accept a hard and demeaning life, the loss of freedom and dignity, the harsh conditions deliberately imposed to discourage all but the truly desperate. It was a grim refuge, offering survival but at a heavy cost, and the poor feared and avoided it, turning to it only when they had no other choice. The workhouse loomed over the lives of the poor as the dreaded last resort, the place one entered only in the depths of destitution. In winter, however, the workhouse offered at least the basic necessities of survival, the shelter and food and warmth that the destitute could not otherwise obtain, and for some, in the hardest times, it was the difference between survival and perishing. When the cold was bitter and all other resources had failed, the workhouse provided at least a roof and a fire and some food, the basic means of surviving the winter that the destitute could find nowhere else. This was the grim function of the workhouse in winter, the provision of bare survival to those who would otherwise have had none. A hard and demeaning refuge, but a refuge nonetheless. For the utterly destitute, the workhouse in winter was sometimes the only alternative to perishing in the cold. The hardship and indignity of the workhouse were real. The harsh regime, the loss of freedom, the demeaning conditions, the separation of families that was often imposed, and these made the workhouse a place of genuine suffering, even as it provided survival. The poor entered it with reluctance and shame, accepting its hardships only because the alternative was worse, and the experience of the workhouse was a hard and often bitter one. We shall not dwell on its harshness, but it is right to acknowledge that this last refuge was a hard one, that the survival it offered came at a heavy cost in dignity and freedom and family life. The workhouse kept the destitute alive, but it was a grim and cheerless salvation. The existence of the workhouse, grim as it was, reflects the harsh realities of poverty in the age and the hard limits of the provision made for the poor, but it also represented, in its way, a recognition that the destitute could not simply be left to perish, that some provision, however harsh, had to be made. The workhouse was a hard and inadequate and often cruel institution, but it did provide a last resort, a bare survival for those who would otherwise have had none. And in the depths of winter, this grim refuge sometimes made the difference between life and death for the most desperate. It stands as a sobering reminder of how hard the winter could be for the poorest, and of the hard limits of the help available to them. Let that sober reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a brighter aspect of the winter, the great midwinter festival that lit the darkest season. Amid all the hardship of the winter, there shone one great bright spot, one season of warmth and cheer and celebration that lit the darkest time of the year, the midwinter festival, the celebration of Christmas, which brought light and warmth and joy into the heart of the cold season. For even the poor found in the midwinter festival a time of special warmth and cheer, a bright interruption of the hard winter, and it is a lovely part of our story, the light that shone in the darkest season. Let us consider, then, the midwinter celebration and what it meant to the poor. The timing of the great midwinter festival, at the very heart of the cold and dark season, was itself significant, a celebration placed precisely at the darkest and coldest time of the year, bringing light and warmth and cheer when they were most needed. There is an ancient wisdom in the placing of a festival of light and warmth at the depth of winter, a defiance of the cold and dark, a bringing of joy into the hardest season, and the Midwinter Festival served this purpose, lighting the darkest time with celebration and cheer. When the winter was at its coldest and darkest, the festival brought its warmth and light, a bright spot in the depths of the hard season. The celebration came when it was most needed. For the poor, the festival was a time of special effort to celebrate, to make merry, and to enjoy a little abundance amid the general scarcity, to mark the season with what warmth and cheer and good things they could manage. Even the poor sought to celebrate the festival, to have a special meal if they could, to bring what cheer and warmth and festivity they could manage into the hard winter, to mark the season as a special time. This effort to celebrate, to find joy and abundance amid the scarcity, was a real and important thing, the poor making of the festival a bright spot in the winter, a time of special warmth and cheer, however modest their means. The festival was a time to make merry as best one could. The celebration brought warmth and light and good cheer into the winter home, the special fire and food, the gathering of family and friends, the decorations and the festivities that brightened the dark season. Greenery brought into the home, the special foods and drinks, the gathering of the family, the songs and the merriment, all brought a warmth and brightness to the midwinter, a festive cheer that lit the hard season. The poor home, decorated and warmed and filled with family and festivity, became for a time a place of special warmth and joy. The festival transforming the hard winter into a season of celebration, however briefly. The Midwinter Festival brought its light and warmth into the humblest homes. There was, in the midwinter celebration, a defiance of the winter, a bringing of warmth and light and joy into the very heart of the cold and dark, an affirmation of life and cheer against the hardship of the season. The festival was, in a sense, the poor's answer to the winter, their insistence on warmth and joy even in the hardest and darkest time, their creation of a bright spot in the depths of the cold. This defiant cheer, this making of joy amid hardship, is one of the loveliest aspects of the winter poor, their determination to celebrate and find warmth and light even in the darkest season, the human spirit affirming itself against the cold. In the midwinter festival, the poor lit the darkness with their own warmth and joy. Let that bright and warm image settle gently in the dark. We turn now to reflect on the remarkable resilience that carried the poor through it all. As we near the end of our journey through the winter of the poor, having seen all the hardships they faced and all the ways they met them, we may pause to reflect on the quality that runs through the whole story, the quality that carried the poor through the hard winters year after year, their remarkable resilience, their endurance and ingenuity, and strength in the face of the cold. For what stands out, when we consider how the poor survived the winter, is the sheer resilience of ordinary people meeting hardship with resourcefulness and courage. The resilience of the poor showed itself, first, in their ingenuity, in the countless clever ways they found to keep warm and survive the cold with such slender means, the resourcefulness that wrung comfort and survival from the simplest resources. The banking of the fire, the sharing of warmth, the warmed stone in the bed, the layering of clothing, the storing of food, all the clever practices we have explored, reflect a deep ingenuity, a resourcefulness born of necessity, the making of the most of little. This cleverness, this ability to find and make and hoard warmth through simple means, was one of the great strengths of the poor, the practical genius of survival that carried them through the winters. Their ingenuity was the ingenuity of necessity, and it was remarkable. Their resilience showed itself, too, in their endurance, in the sheer capacity to bear hardship, to endure the cold and the darkness and the want, to keep going through the long, hard winters without giving up. The poor bore what would seem to us intolerable hardship, the cold and the discomfort and the difficulty, with a stoic endurance that is genuinely impressive, meeting the hard winters not with despair, but with a determined getting on, a bearing of what had to be borne. This endurance, this capacity to bear and to persist through hardship, was a great strength, the quiet courage that carried the poor through the winters, and it deserves our real respect. They endured what they had to endure, and they kept going, and their resilience showed itself in their mutual support, in the drawing together of family and community against the cold, the sharing and the caring and the helping that we have seen throughout, the bonds that helped all to survive. The poor did not face the winter as isolated individuals, but as families and communities, drawing on one another, sharing warmth and food and help, caring for the vulnerable, supporting one another through the hard season. This mutual support, this facing of hardship together, was one of the great strengths of the poor, the bonds of family and community providing the security and support that helped all to survive. In their togetherness was their strength, and it carried them through. When we consider all this, the ingenuity and the endurance and the mutual support, we cannot but be moved to admiration for the poor of that age, for their remarkable resilience in the face of hardship that we can scarcely imagine, their survival of the hard winters through their own strength and cleverness and solidarity. There is something genuinely inspiring in this resilience, this meeting of hardship with resourcefulness and courage and mutual care, this survival against real odds through the strength of ordinary people. The poor of the Victorian winter were not merely victims of their hardship, but survivors of it, and their resilience is one of the most admirable things in the whole story. Let that admiring reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the hope that sustained them through it all, the longing for spring. Through all the long, hard months of winter, there was one thing that sustained the poor, one hope that lay always ahead however distant, one certainty that gave them the strength to endure, the knowledge that winter would end, that spring would come again, that the cold and the dark would give way in time to warmth and light. This longing for spring, this hope of the winter's ending, was a real and sustaining thing, and it is a fitting note on which to near the end of our journey through the cold season. Let us consider, then, the hope that carried the poor through the winter. The winter, however long and hard, was known to be a season, a thing that would pass, and the certainty of its ending was a real comfort through the hard months. The knowledge that the cold and dark were temporary, that warmth and light would return. However bitter the winter, the poor knew that it would not last forever, that spring would come again as it always had, and this certainty sustained them, the hope of the winter's ending giving strength to endure its hardships. The seasons turned, as they always had, and the hard winter would give way in time to the gentler seasons, and this knowledge was a real support through the cold. Winter would end, and spring would come. As the winter wore on and the worst of the cold began, slowly, to ease, the poor watched for the signs of the coming spring, the lengthening of the days, the first hints of warmth, the earliest signs that the hard season was passing. The gradual lengthening of the days after the depth of midwinter, the slow return of the light, the first faint signs of the coming spring, were watched for eagerly and greeted with hope, the evidence that the winter was passing and the warmth returning. These signs of spring, however faint and however slow, were a real comfort and joy, the promise of the winter's ending made visible, and the poor watched for them and took heart from them through the last hard weeks of the cold. The lengthening days were a promise of hope. The coming of spring, when at last it arrived, brought a real release and joy. The ending of the hard winter, the return of warmth and light, and the fresh abundance of the growing season, a relief and a gladness after the long, hard months. The arrival of spring meant the end of the winter's hardships, the return of warmth that needed no fire, of light that needed no candle, of fresh food growing again, a release from the long trial of the cold. This coming of spring was greeted with real joy, the gladness of survivors who had come through the hard season, the relief and delight of the winter's ending. Spring was the reward for having endured the winter, the return of warmth and ease after the long cold. There is something deeply human and deeply hopeful in this longing for spring, this sustaining hope of the winter's ending, this faith that the hard season would pass and the warmth return. It reflects the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity to endure hardship in the hope of better times, the faith in the turning of the seasons and the return of warmth and light. The poor endured the winter sustained by this hope, this certainty that spring would come, and in their longing for spring we see the hope that carries people through all hardship, the faith in better times ahead that gives the strength to endure. Winter would end, spring would come, and the poor held to that hope through the long cold. Let that hopeful reflection settle gently in the dark. We turn now to reflect on the warmth we ourselves so easily enjoy, and so easily forget. Having journeyed through the hard winter of the poor, having seen how precious and hard-won their warmth was, we may find ourselves looking with new eyes at our own warm and comfortable world, and feeling, perhaps, a quiet and unaccustomed gratitude for the effortless warmth we enjoy and so easily take for granted. For the contrast between the winter of the poor and our own is vast, and reflecting on it can give us a deeper appreciation of the comfort we so rarely think about. Let us consider, then, the warmth we forget. We live in a world of effortless warmth, where the turn of a dial fills our homes with heat, where every room is warm, where we need never really feel the cold within our own homes. And this is a comfort so complete and so constant that we scarcely notice it at all. The warmth that the poor struggled so hard to obtain, that they won through such effort and ingenuity and endurance, comes to us without thought or labour, filling our homes at our command. We do not gather fuel, or bank the fire, or pile on coverings, or huddle together for warmth, or dread the cold, for the warmth is simply there, effortless and abundant, whenever we want it. This is an extraordinary comfort, and we hardly ever think of it. Consider how many of the hardships we have explored tonight simply do not exist for us. The struggle for fuel, the cold homes, the frozen mornings, the piled coverings, the dread of the cold nights, all of it swept away by the simple miracle of modern heating. We wake in warm homes, we move through warm rooms, we sleep in warm beds. We never really feel the bitter cold that was the constant companion of the winter poor. And all the elaborate strategies they needed simply to keep warm are, for us, entirely unnecessary. The whole hard struggle against the cold that shaped their winters has vanished from our lives, replaced by an effortless warmth we command without a thought. What was for them a daily battle is for us a non-issue. And consider the security of it, the freedom from the fear that the cold could genuinely harm, that the failure to keep warm could threaten health and even survival. For the poor, the cold was a real danger, and the keeping warm a matter of real seriousness. But for us, the cold holds no such terror, our warmth secure and abundant, the dangers of the cold banished from our comfortable lives. We need not fear the winter as the poor feared it, need not dread the cold nights, need not worry that we cannot keep warm, for our warmth is assured, a security so complete that we never even think of it. The fear that shadowed the winter of the poor has been lifted entirely from our lives. To reflect on all this is to feel a proper gratitude for the warmth we enjoy, the effortless and abundant and secure warmth that would have seemed an impossible luxury to the winter poor, brought into focus by the contrast with their hard season. As you lie there now, warm and safe and comfortable, with warmth all around you that costs you no effort and no fear, you enjoy a comfort that the poor of that age could scarcely have imagined, a warmth beyond their dreams. To remember their hard winter is to appreciate our own warm one, to feel gratitude for the extraordinary comfort we so easily forget, the effortless warmth that surrounds us. Let that grateful reflection settle gently in the dark, and feel, as you do, how warm and safe you are. We turn now to the human beings at the heart of this whole story, the people of the cold. As we near the end of our long winter journey, let us turn from the fires and the blankets and the strategies of warmth to the human beings at the heart of it all, the real people who lived through those hard winters, who huddled by the fires and shared the beds and endured the cold, as human as ourselves. For behind every practice and hardship we have explored were living people, with all their love and courage and endurance, and it is in remembering them as people that we find the deepest meaning in our journey through the cold. Think of the families gathered by the winter fire, drawing close for warmth and company through the long, dark evenings, the parents and children together in the firelight, bound by love and by the shared struggle against the cold. These were real families, with all the love and care and closeness that families know, made all the closer by the hardship they faced together, the sharing of warmth and the drawing together against the cold, binding them in a deep togetherness. In the winter home, gathered by the fire, the family was a place of love and warmth as well as of shared hardship, the human bonds that made the cold bearable. Behind the strategies of warmth was the warmth of the loving family. Think of the parents who laboured to keep their children warm, who gave the best place by the fire to the old and the young, who worked and gathered and contrived to provide the warmth and food that their families needed, out of love and duty and devotion. The care of the vulnerable, the protection of the children and the old, the effort to provide for the family through the hard season, all reflected the deep love and devotion of ordinary people for those they cared for. There is something deeply moving in this devotion, this labour of love in the face of hardship. The parents and family members giving of themselves to keep their loved ones warm and safe through the winter. Their care for one another was the warmest thing of all. Think of the sheer courage and endurance of ordinary people meeting the hard winters year after year, bearing the cold and the hardship with resilience and even with cheer, finding warmth and comfort and joy amid the difficulty. These were people of remarkable strength, meeting hardship that we can scarcely imagine with a quiet courage and endurance. And even, in the midwinter festival and the fireside gathering and the pleasures of the children, with real joy and warmth. Their capacity to endure and to find comfort and joy amid the hardship speaks of a deep human resilience, the strength of ordinary people that carried them through the hard winters. They endured, and they even, in their way, flourished, finding warmth and joy in the cold. In remembering the people of the cold in this way, we move beyond the mere cataloguing of winter hardships and strategies to a deeper and more sympathetic understanding, seeing in the winter poor, not distant historical figures but fellow human beings, with the same needs for warmth and comfort and love that we have, the same courage and care and resilience. They faced the cold as we would face it, sought warmth and comfort as we do, loved and cared for their families as we do, and met their hardships with a courage and resilience that we can only admire. Behind all the winters of the past were real people, as human as ourselves, and it is right that we remember them, and honour their endurance, and feel our kinship with them across the years. Let that human recognition settle gently in the dark. We turn now to our final gentle thought, the thread that connects us to them across the centuries. As our long winter night draws toward its close, let us hold one final, gentle thought, a thought that reaches across all the years between the winter pour and our own warm age, and finds, in the end, a deep and human connection. For all the difference between their hard winters and our comfortable ones, the poor of that age were, at bottom, human beings just like us, seeking warmth and comfort and safety as we do, and in contemplating their winters, we are contemplating something of our own shared humanity across the centuries. The search for warmth, which shaped so much of the winter poor's lives, is one of the most ancient and universal of human experiences. The seeking of warmth against the cold, the making of fire and the sharing of heat, and the drawing together for comfort, an experience as old as humanity itself. In their struggle for warmth, the winter poor were doing what humans have always done, what we ourselves do in our own way, seeking the warmth and comfort that the body and the spirit need against the cold of the world. This ancient human search for warmth connects us to them and to all the generations who have sought warmth against the winter, a thread of shared experience running back through all the ages. We seek warmth as they sought it, as all people always have. And the deeper warmths they sought, the warmth of family and company and togetherness, the drawing close of loved ones against the cold, are warmths that we seek too, the human warmths that matter as much as the warmth of any fire. The winter poor found their deepest warmth not in the fire alone, but in one another, in the family gathered close, in the sharing of warmth and company and love. And this human warmth is something we understand and seek ourselves, the warmth of belonging and love that no cold can touch. In their gathering together against the cold, in the warmth they found in one another, the winter poor knew a warmth that we know too, the warmth of the human heart. This warmth connects us across all the years. There is something steadying and gentle in this thought, this sense of connection across the centuries to the people who sought warmth and comfort in those hard winters long ago. They are gone now, every one of them, the families who gathered by the winter fires, the children who huddled together for warmth, the old who were given the warm place by the hearth, all long since passed into history, their hard winters long over, their struggles long ended, all of them now at rest. But they were here, they lived, they sought warmth and comfort and found it. They endured the cold and cared for one another and got through. And we are connected to them by the long thread of our shared humanity, the common human search for warmth and comfort and love. And so we can let them rest now, the people of those long ago winters, with a kind of tenderness and gratitude, a recognition of our shared humanity and our kinship across the years. Their winters were hard and their warmth was hard won, but they met the cold with courage and ingenuity and love, and they found their warmth and their comfort and their joy, even in the hardest season. Let that gentle sense of connection settle over you now, warm and quiet, as we prepare at last to let the whole long story go and drift away into sleep. Let it carry you gently toward rest, this thought of the long human family of which you are a part, all of us seeking warmth against the cold, stretching back through the winters of the past and far beyond. We turn now, at last, towards sleep. So let it all go now, gently, the whole long world we have wandered through tonight, the entire hard and warm and human world of the winter poor. Let it fade, the way the past fades, the way the years dissolve into a soft and shapeless distance, the cottages and the hearths, the piled blankets and the warmed stones, the gathered families and the glowing fires, all growing dim and quiet and far away, until there is only the warm dark, and your own slow breathing, and the gathering tide of sleep. Let the winter fires burn low and dim, their glow softening into the dark. Let the cottages grow quiet, the families settled warm in their beds, the long cold night wrapping the sleeping world in its silence. Let the whole hard winter of the poor, all the struggle and the warmth and the endurance, drift gently away into the deep dark of the past, all of them long at rest now, all of them warm at last, all of them beyond all cold and all hardship, at peace. They are gone now, every one of them, their hard winters long over, their cold nights long past, generations upon generations at rest, warm at last in the long sleep, and there is a great soft quiet where all their struggle once was. Let them rest, warm and peaceful. And now, at last, so can you. Feel the warmth of your bed, soft and safe around you. Feel the weight of the blanket, gentle upon you. Feel how warm you are, how easily the warmth comes to you, how there is nothing you need to do to be warm and safe and comfortable. No fire to tend, no cold to fear, no long dark night to endure, only the soft warmth and the deep quiet and the simple comfort of rest. Feel how fortunate you are, warm and safe in your own bed, and feel your breathing slow and your body soften, and the small cares of the day loosen their grip, one by one, and drift away into the warm dark, until there is only you, and the warmth, and the deep and rising quiet. And feel, perhaps, a quiet gratitude as you lie there, warm and safe, for the effortless warmth that surrounds you, the warmth that the poor of that age could only dream of, the comfort that is yours without effort or fear. You are warm, and you are safe, and you are free simply to rest, wrapped in a warmth that needs no tending, secure from the cold that once meant so much struggle and even danger. There is nothing to fear and nothing to endure, only the soft surrender to sleep, the gentle sinking down into the warm and shapeless dark, where all is warm and quiet and well. You are as warm and safe as any soul has ever been, and you may simply rest. The whole long story we have travelled, the whole hard winter of the poor, can simply be set down now and released, dissolving into the warm dark, leaving you weightless and at peace, drifting gently down into sleep. And if any last image still lingers at the edge of your thoughts, some glowing hearth, some family gathered warm by the fire, some cosy bed piled high with coverings, let it grow soft now, and slow, and distant, the way a story fades as you slip past its edge into sleep, the images dimming, the warmth remaining, the whole long winter world dissolving quietly into the warm and shapeless dark. You can simply let it drift away, like the day itself, like the past itself, out into the quiet and gone. Good night, traveller. The old hard winters are long over, all their cold long past, all their people long at rest and warm at last, and you are safe and warm and well, and so, at last, you may rest too. Rest easy, sleep deep. I'll be here, somewhere in the quiet, when you wake.